Today I'm going to show you guys how to remove the rear brake drums on an old vehicle. This is specifically a 1954 Plymouth Belvedere. It's going to be a very similar process for pretty much any old car that has the brake drums pressed onto the axle. This is just for the rears. You're almost never going to encounter this kind of brake drum on the fronts. So obviously it's going to start out pretty much like any one of these rear brake jobs, just removing the cotter pin and the castle nut there. Usually these are going to be pretty rusted because there's not a cap on top of them. So just keep that in mind. You're probably going to want to try to loosen this with an impact. It's going to be 1 1/4 inches. I think that's also the same as like 32. All right. Okay, so if this were a front drum, obviously we could just pull it right off. Wouldn't be a problem. This is actually pressed on to the axle stub or axle shaft there, and there's a keyway. So the key usually, well, no, it should stay in the drum itself. We're going to have to pull this thing off, and that's what all this shiny crap down here is for. So this is a drum puller. It goes just like this. These little arms go in a slot on this ring, and then you bolt it to the drum itself with the original lug nuts, or in this case, lug bolts. So this is the tool that I have, and it broke right out of the box. Well, I say right out of the box, right when I tried to use it. There were a couple issues. This piece right here is not hardened very well, so these threads started to strip on me. Luckily, I noticed before I destroyed it. The next thing that broke was up here on the front. Right here, you have this cone, which is what sits on there, and there is a snap ring pretty much, or like a compression ring that's made of metal that goes around here. And right in the very beginning, that thing snapped in half and broke. And then this right here sunk back into the tool. And so I was pushing this right here on the part itself. And that was no good because this would have been pushing against the drum. So I had to thread the nut on a little bit and use that as a shoulder. It was kind of a debacle and it was really stupid. So that's why I didn't video that part. This time around, it should go a little bit better though. So as you can see, I found the pieces of the snap ring and I welded them on there. So that should keep this tool from sinking down inside there. There's an O-ring here that I removed just so I could show you all this stuff right here, and also so I could weld that ring. I will say that grease is going to be a very important part of using this cheap tool. So if you're going to use one of these cheap tools from Amazon, which honestly, I mean, for some people, it's going to be your best bet, is lots of grease, lots of heat on the part itself, and just kind of trying to be a little bit smart if you can, to know when enough is enough and you need to back down on your banging and smashing a little bit. There are some vintage tools that are made for this specific task. That definitely, well, that probably won't break on you. Unfortunately, those are extremely expensive. And for someone who's just doing this job one time, or maybe taking something apart and is never going to mess with this again, it's hard to justify that cost. So this car is going to eventually get an 8.8 rear end, but until then, I need to have brakes. So we are going to go ahead and replace the shoes and the wheel cylinders. So I've got to get all this stuff apart. All right, so we're going to get those on, then we're going to stick this nut back on here. And what this is going to do is help us keep the tool centered. That is, if it stays together and doesn't fall apart like it did last time. All right, so we'll test it here and see if that's enough. So this cone right here is going to go inside here. Well, if these arms weren't in the way, the cone would go inside there. And we want the cone to touch the shaft pretty much, not the nut. The nut's just helping us keep everything centered. Now I'm going to see if we can get this thing in here with these little arms all in place. Okay, there's the next one, and there's the last one. So I was pretty much turning this disc right here, and then also turning the arm at the same time into a little notch, which here I'll rotate towards the camera. Maybe you can see that, maybe you can't. There's a little notch right there that these arms go in and out of pretty much. Keeps them from just coming off when you don't want them to. All right, so then what we're gonna do is just turn this thing in until it touches the axle shaft. You can do this with the impact, but it's best not to use the impact for the entire process, honestly. We'll put some grease here and some grease there on the axle itself, because we want to try to take out all of the, or as much of the friction as possible, so the tool can do its job instead of eating itself alive. All right, so once that's sort of straight, let's go ahead and take up most of the slack with the impact here. Okay, so depending on the tools that you have, you can keep hitting this with an impact if you want to. If you have a socket deep enough, eventually you're gonna run out of room and the socket's not gonna be of any use. And then you're gonna take this piece right here, slide it on there, and then you're gonna beat the crap out of it with a hammer. So during all this, important things to watch out for are, make sure that this centerpiece is not stripping out inside here. And one way that you can do that is by every now and then, once you go in a certain amount, try to back out and see if this tool is stripping out in here. I know it's stupid and redundant, but it's much better than ruining all this and then having a tool stuck onto your axle. The other thing that you need to watch out for is take a look inside here and see if this piece is, the centerpiece I mean, is sinking into the shaft, because that would be bad as well. That's really important if you're using a nut on here. If you're not using a nut, it's actually a little bit worse, because then this right here is going to touch the drum and you're just going to be fighting yourself if you're not paying attention and destroying everything. So that's not a good thing. Don't destroy stuff. Let's go ahead and sink this thing down with the impact as far as we can get it, and then we're going to start to apply heat, which is going to be the key to this entire job. All right, so we've got this thing sunk down a good bit. It's nice if you can to set up your torch on something that can hold it for you. I guess you probably shouldn't do that, but I'm going to do that in this case. That way I can take a good look at the video and make sure everything is working the way that I want it to in the camera shot. So I'm gonna turn this thing around, and man, I can tell you for sure inside there we have some issues. So I bet that brake shoe material is completely falling apart. But we want to heat up the brake drum on this outer snout here, because that's what's actually interfacing with the taper on the axle itself. So I'm going to go ahead and get this thing heated up. I'm going to try to do it pretty evenly. I'm going to do it on this side for a minute, and then I'll move it to the back side right there. And then once we have a good bit of heat on this thing, then we'll go ahead and start cranking it down. In my opinion, there isn't any point in cranking on any of this kind of stuff unless you have a torch. It's probably not going to come off. I've had the torch going for a pretty good bit of time on both sides that I have really good access to the snout on the drum there. So let's go ahead and see if that made any difference. We're not only fighting the taper, but we're fighting these shoes that have come apart inside here too. All right, let's go ahead and do some whamming. We've done some. Go ahead and see if we can there. So I don't know I think it's an error. You can carefully on top here. See if you can report the other so you're going to take out of it. You're going to use drums. You always want to be careful. So turn around. Do another lip. So patience and torch are two very, very important things. If you get exhaust is the bang, you should be hitting or waiting. See if it's for every job, do the robot. All right, just move away, and then we're going to watch out for a while. Yeah, there we go. You can see how important it is to stick that nut back on. If that nut was not on there, this thing could have shot off and damaged itself or me. All right, so this is what I want to talk about as far as the lug nuts or bolts getting stuck in your tool. So depending on how tight you can get these and what size they are, you may press these into these arms. And luckily I didn't run into that issue, but I could see it definitely being a problem on certain vehicles or certain lug nuts. I was having a hard time just being able to get to these things to even tighten them. And they are still pretty dang hot. So depending on how bad your drums and shoes situation are, you may want to go ahead and put the tool back on, or at least just remove this nut here and stick the tool back on. I'm going to see if I can pound this thing off, but I may have to put it back on because the shoes are all jacked up inside. I'm just pulling the crap out of this pretty much. There we go. Okay. All right. I just didn't want to remove that lug bolt entirely until I got this thing all the way off, since it was so tight. So it looks like we're not missing any major sections of the lining from the shoes, which is cool. All four wheels of this car were totally locked up when I bought it. If you guys saw my recovery video, this thing had been sitting for 50 years, which is kind of insane. It's definitely the longest a vehicle has ever sat that I have gotten to move. And this thing technically runs and drives. It'll be a whole lot better once it has brakes, of course. But anyway, but on the other side, all the lining was just completely off. So I had kind of beat around the drums one day when I first got it home, so this thing was more movable around the yard, like by hand and stuff like that. And in the process of driving this thing for the very first time, it just totally ripped all of this liner off, and it was disgusting. I mean, it wasn't even hard anymore. It's like all gummy and gross. But yeah, I'm not going to go into depth on the actual brake job itself. I don't think. I wanted to keep this video sort of short and really just kind of show you guys the process for using that tool there when you have a taper on your axle. So I'll put a link in the description to a better tool than this one. I kind of bought a little bit cheaper one, but I'll find one that's a little bit nicer and put a link to it. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. Thanks for watching.